Andrew Yang has a bright idea for combating the threat of white nationalism in the wake of the El Paso shooting, which is that the Congress should pass a new law to combat domestic terrorism. Now, I would have thought that recent history has shown that any policies which are enacted in the wake of quote-unquote terrorist attacks tend to have a bevy of unintended detrimental consequences, and sometimes intended detrimental consequences, because when a terrorist attack occurs, people's concern for civil liberties tends to drastically diminish. And in the wake of these attacks is when civil liberties need to be most stridently protected, because emotions are running high. People reasonably are demanding that something be done. And it turns out that most of what they advocate be done tends to have adverse effects on people's basic rights. Now, the most consequential example in recent history is, I'm sure people are aware, the Patriot Act, which was passed almost immediately after 9/11 without barely anybody having read the actual bill. And the Patriot Act still today grants the federal law enforcement apparatus with sweeping authority to surveil and monitor otherwise law-abiding citizens in the name of safety and counterterrorism, quote unquote. But there's another law which is less well known but still incredibly consequential, that was passed under different circumstances and might be more applicable now as a relevant parallel to consider. The Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was carried out by Timothy McVeigh, who was thought to be a white nationalist of some kind, or at least he is sort of a precursor to what is today considered white nationalism. Obviously, the whole internet scene where white nationalism, quote unquote, tends to marinate was not as present then, although there are antecedents that are relevant to Timothy McVeigh. So in the wake of that bombing, Congress said, we must act. We must, quote, do something. And what did they do? They drafted a bipartisan bill entitled the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which was done as a direct response to the Oklahoma City bombing. It was cited as a necessary antidote to whatever issues had allowed the Oklahoma City bombing to take place. But ironically, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 ultimately had little effect at all on Timothy McVeigh himself. He was actually executed somewhat expeditiously because he chose to forfeit his appeals. Whereas other people in the prison system nationwide were deprived of their basic rights under this act, because what it did was it diminished the ability of people who have been convicted of crimes and sentenced to either death or long sentences to obtain exculpatory evidence that might change the facts which underlie their conviction. And to hammer that point home, consider what Abner Mikva, a federal court judge who is now deceased but who was very much attuned to these debates when they were happening, he now says, or no, he's deceased, but he said a few years ago that innocent people were likely executed as a result of this law because they were not able to appeal their state convictions to higher courts in a way, because one of the main provisions of this bill was to streamline the death penalty process. And the death penalty process is notoriously prone to error, and a wide array of people have been exonerated who were on death row because they were able to appeal and bring to light new evidence. And this bill passed in 1996 and signed into law by Bill Clinton on a gloriously bipartisan basis had serious adverse effects on civil liberties, and the most vulnerable people in terms of who needs to really have their civil liberties protected are those who are incarcerated and perhaps wrongly incarcerated, which is quite common in the American system. Here's what Stephen Reinhard, also deceased, a former circuit judge, said of this bill. Quote, so what this bill essentially did was it gutted habeas corpus, which is the most foundational, or one of the most foundational legal tenets in American jurisprudence dating back centuries, which says that you have a right to hear the charges against you if you are detained by the government. This bill, which is still the law on the books, caused the people who are convicted of crimes to no longer be able to hear the charges against them in a context of bringing forth new evidence. So here's what Stephen Reinhart said about this bill. Habeas corpus has, quote, been transformed over the past 2 decades from a vital guarantor of liberty into an instrument for ratifying the power of the state courts to disregard the protections of the Constitution. So the ability of federal courts to review state convictions was drastically reduced. And so the rights of habeas corpus that are supposed to be enjoyed by all were also reduced, and according to various analyses, that resulted in wrongful executions. Mostly of people who had nothing to do with terrorism, right? So this bill was passed in the aftermath of a, quote, terrorist attack, and yet the policy impact was, by and large, overwhelmingly on people who were not remotely connected to what's traditionally understood as terrorism, but were convicted of sort of ordinary crimes that are prosecuted at the state level. And so the bar for overturning those types of convictions was also raised, and we are still dealing with the after effects of that law. So Andrew Yang, I would humbly suggest, should go and review the history of policies that were enacted in the aftermath of these, quote, terrorist attacks, and see that there are a host of unintended or arguably intended negative consequences that almost inevitably arise when the government acts in this manner. And you should always be suspicious when there is a flurry of, quote, bipartisan unity around these types of issues. It happened with this act in 1996. It happened with the Patriot Act. And even now Trump got on TV earlier this morning and declared that he is basically in sync with the Democrats in terms of their proposed solutions. He wants more stringent monitoring and surveillance of the internet, which Democrats and liberal pundits have been calling for. And he seems like he's very likely on board with a new counterterrorism statute of the kind that Yang and others have proposed. So that's always worrying when elements of the political class unite around what are essentially authoritarian ideals, and ideals that are not anywhere near sufficiently mindful of the civil liberties implications. So that is something to be aware of now, given that we're in this situation where people are shouting terrorism and shouting for something to be done. Now, why do I use scare quotes, and why am I generally somewhat dismissive of the invocation of the term terrorism? Well, it's because whenever terrorism is invoked, whenever that specter is referenced, it almost inevitably results in the eradication of core civil liberties, because it exalts political violence or other forms of violence into this sort of metaphysical strata where it's unique and it's thought of through an entirely different prism. And subsequently, what happens is people start to surrender their critical faculties and are more likely to accept the erosion of civil liberties because they are so invested in the notion of this terroristic threat that must be defeated. So I say the same thing when purported terrorism is carried out by Islamists, by white identity extremists. It doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that terrorism is such a loaded term that it causes people to kind of meekly sit and accept what they wouldn't accept in other circumstances in terms of their rights and liberties. And so rather than, as some liberal pundits are calling for, demand that we expand the scope of what constitutes terrorism in the public mind, rather what I think we should do, and what I would advocate that we should do, is take a more even-keeled and level-headed approach to all forms of political violence, whether it's carried out by some 19-year-old who reads extremist Islamist literature online and then does something murderous, or whether it's one of these people who are living on 8chan and decide that they're going to end their lives by killing people in a Walmart because they are upset about demographic change or whatever the convoluted rationale may be. I just don't think that entering into the frame of mind where terrorism is sort of the operative variable that we're dealing with is ever conducive to good policy, healthy public debate, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't matter what side of the coin you're talking about, whether it's Islamism, white nationalism, or any other ideology which may encourage acts of political violence. Political violence has been with us since the dawn of time. It will always be with us. We have to have a more rational approach to properly contextualizing and responding to political violence without overreacting and overcompensating by calling for deleterious policy initiatives. So that's the point I wanted to make, and I will talk to you later.